No matter who you are, what you do, or what level of fame or status that you've attained, I can virtually guarantee you one thing in life. Nobody is ever really gonna understand you. That probably seems like a really bleak way to start a video, but let me assure you that I say it with nothing but optimism in my heart. In fact, I'm pretty firmly of the belief that the surest way to live a happy and fulfilled life is to accept this reality and to apply the correct takeaways. And one of my favorite movies from the last decade is one that shows us what can go wrong when we fail to do this. I'm talking about Mark Mylod's The Menu, released in 2022. There are a lot of things that can be taken away from that movie. It's a dark satire about a disgruntled chef who decides to turn his multi-course tasting menu into a lesson that his guests won't forget. The movie seems to have just as much to say about the patrons of fine dining restaurants as it does about the borderline monastic degree of focus and sacrifice that it takes to operate one. People who have worked in or who have regularly dined in these types of environments probably connected with the movie on a deeper level than I did, and they probably took away more from the movie. And to those people I'd say, what, do you think you're fucking better than me? No, to those people I'd say that the movie probably does have deeper levels to its messaging than I was able to pick up on. There are a lot of things about this movie that are worth talking about, including the incredible creative effort that went into the design of its dishes, or its excellent attention to continuity, which you see in the way that you can always tell based on the background details what the next dish that's going to be served is. Nonetheless, when this movie pops into my mind, which happens very often, it's for one very specific reason. I find the character of Chef Slowik, who's played by Ralph Fiennes, to be unbelievably compelling. And I find one scene of his in particular to be a very effective distillation of a lot of the greatest wisdom that's been passed down to us over the millennia, wisdom that I've struggled over the years to apply in my own life. I hope to explain by the end of this video why this scene alone has carved out such an enormous space in my mind, to say nothing of the movie's other numerous accomplishments. Chef Slowik is presented in the movie as a true savant, a real culinary genius at the top of his field. The fact that the directors brought on real-life 3 Michelin-star chef Dominique Crenn to design the literal menu that's served in the movie leads me to the conclusion that we're supposed to buy him not just as an elite chef, but as a real one-of-a-kind visionary. And the material success that he's achieved seems to be in line with this. He runs a world-renowned restaurant located on a gorgeous private island that he lives on, along with his army of fanatical devotees who worship the ground that he walks on. His dining room is regularly filled with some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. And these people don't just pop in, they reserve their spots well in advance and commit to an entire evening that both begins and ends with a chartered boat ride. I mean, that's normally how it would end. For a lot of young, ambitious chefs, his life probably represents something close to what their wildest dreams of success would look like. And yet, despite having a life that many would kill to have, Slowik is not only dissatisfied with the way that his life is played out, he's gotten to the point that running his restaurant brings him nothing but misery. And putting it that way is a bit of an understatement. Kind of like saying that Jack Torrance had suboptimal strategies for dealing with writer's block. And while most of us would stop well short of the extremes that Slowik goes to in acting on his feelings, I think that most of us would be lying if we said that we couldn't relate to his feelings at all. You see, in the setting that the film takes place in, Slowik is essentially the Mozart of food, and the food that he produces is a deep reflection of both his awesome talent and of the perspectives and memories that uniquely define him as a person. He's truly without equal in his craft, and yet on a nightly basis, his dining room is filled with people who fail to appreciate his work in the way that he so deeply wishes they would. He tries to nudge his guests towards appreciating it in the way that he wants them to. For instance, he asks that they refrain from photographing his food and instead just experience it. But despite this, his customers don't seem to primarily be interested in having an experience. They seem much more interested in how others will perceive them because of the fact that they were in his restaurant. They don't experience his food for its own sake, and they don't have any sense of how rare or how special the mind of its creator is. Their enjoyment of the food stops and ends at what it does for them and their egos. The basic problem that Slowik experiences in the movie is an old one. It's a problem that people across times and cultures have experienced. Nobody seems to get us. Nobody sees in us the things that we value in ourselves. What other people see in us is fundamentally tied up in what our work does for their base needs. And I think, as with most things that bother us, if you think about it long enough, it becomes clear that this is a sub-fear of our larger fear of death, of the idea that we'll eventually fade to dust and nothing will be left of us. If people see us self-referentially in terms of how our work helps them climb the base levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then when we die, it's like the things that made us unique just scatter to the wind, no matter what level of fame or status we'd achieved. In death, we can no longer make people feel safe or nourish them or give them goods that elevate their own sense of importance. And if this is what people valued us for, then when we die, it's like the things that defined us in our own minds disappear. The moment that our heartbeat gives out, it's almost like those things never existed at all. In fact, I think that for most of us, this is the thing that we really fear about death. Not simply the mechanical act of losing consciousness. After all, we were all as good as dead before we were born, and we all end our day with a voluntary act of suspending our consciousness. We don't primarily fear a loss of consciousness. We fear that the things that we value in ourselves will fade to nothing. And to Chef Slowik and his followers, the realization that they'll never achieve the type of recognition that they crave through the service that they provide to their guests drives them to attempt to immortalize themselves in another way, through an act that's simultaneously horrifying and symbolically potent. An act that will no doubt be talked about long after they're gone. But to say nothing about the atrocious moral implications of their actions, even this murderous spectacle is the equivalent of building a basalt statue. It'll only carry on the memory of the people who committed it for a time, and that memory will be an imperfect snapshot of who these people truly were. It's an act of horrifying futility, but it's one that shows us just how deeply people feel a need to be recognized, understood, and appreciated. There's a whole body of thought that's at least a couple thousand years old at this point that provide invaluable tools for dealing with this kind of suffering, and the work of the Roman Stoic philosophers is probably the best starting point. This is by no means a comprehensive summary of Stoic philosophy, but I do think that one of the most important ideas in this body of work is pretty well summarized in a single passage from Meditations written by Emperor Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. A line of thought that runs through the work of the Stoics is the idea that if you value things that aren't in your direct control, then your satisfaction in life is going to be a function of whether the cosmic dice roll in your favor. You can paint a great painting, but if your definition of success in life requires that others recognize you as a great painter, then you might live a life of misery regardless of how talented you are. This was very much the case for Vincent Van Gogh. The status that he now holds in our mind as one of the greatest painters that ever lived really started to take shape after he died. From letters that he wrote during his life, we get a sense that he was very strongly affected by how others perceived his work. I won't try to summarize his life here, and it's worth mentioning that he may have suffered from mental illness of the type that we would diagnose and medicate today. But I do think that it's fair to say that despite having an incredible one-of-a-kind talent and having produced works that we find so much joy in today, Van Gogh's life seems to have been one marked by great difficulties and intense suffering. One of his most famous paintings, The Starry Night, shows a scene that he painted inside of a room that he was checked into in the St. Paul Asylum. In fact, he had checked himself into this asylum after suffering a mental breakdown. Today, this is one of the most recognizable and celebrated paintings ever produced, but Van Gogh himself was supposedly deeply critical of the painting. In a letter to his brother, he described it as mostly being a failure. I can't tell you whether painting as a pursuit brought Van Gogh more happiness or suffering in his life. I can't tell you what the ultimate causes of the hardships that he faced were. I can't tell you any of those things. The inner qualities that made him unique as a man and an artist were probably not even really understood by his family members and closest friends. So you and I stand no chance of figuring out who this man was in any meaningful sense by reading his letters and viewing his paintings. We know Van Gogh as an icon, as someone who represents something to us, and to every modern viewer of his work, the act of trying to figure out who he was is something of an inkblot test. We'll all see the parts of his story that are specifically meaningful to us. An artist who's producing work that they feel is underappreciated might see in Van Gogh a kind of hope. The idea that the pain and suffering that they're feeling might manifest itself in great works that will stand the test of time. But here's my question to you. Do you think that this is how Van Gogh would have wanted us to see him? I don't have an answer to that question. I raise it just to point out that we see his work self-referentially. We see it in terms of what it can teach us about art, about life, about mental health and emotional well-being, etc. We don't see who this man really was. We're powerless to see it even if we'd like to. And for every Van Gogh, every Kafka, every Melville who only achieved fame and recognition after they died, we can only hope that they found some satisfaction in producing the work that they did, in creating for the sake of creation. We can only hope that the fundamental insight of the Stoics occurred to them in one way or another. The idea that a life lived for the sake of impressing or pleasing other people is a life in which we can only accidentally and periodically experience happiness. As valuable as this Stoic insight is, a problem can very easily arise as one tries to apply it in their life. This advice only offers a negative prescription. It only tells us what not to do. Without some kind of beacon to go after, without a guiding North Star principle that tells us how we ought to spend our finite time, just knowing that we shouldn't waste our lives trying to impress people doesn't tell us how we should spend our time. The advice that we ought to look for internal sources of happiness is unbelievably valuable, but it doesn't automatically set us up to live happy and fulfilled lives. After all, a lot of people are going to have some form of this insight independently and apply it for themselves without ever bothering to find out what some dead Roman dudes had to say about the nature of suffering. We'll start out by picking a career based on what we enjoy doing because on some level we understand this is the only way that we can ensure that we live a fulfilled life. But as we embark on these careers, the issue ends up being that we're so fundamentally hardwired to seek social approval and to derive pleasure from our placement in the social hierarchy. It's unfortunately just a part of the evolutionary hand that we've been dealt. Without some guiding principle that steers us through life, we can very easily start to drift towards primarily deriving satisfaction in our lives from our sense of how others perceive us. And a part of the reason that a lot of people don't sense this happening in their lives is that the process of climbing any social hierarchy is so well gamified. In a lot of cases, you just don't have the space you need to stop and reflect on why you're doing what you're doing. Every promotion that you receive just lays out what the next promotion, the chase is. The assistant manager becomes the manager, becomes the regional manager, becomes the vice president, becomes the CEO, etc., so on and so forth. People have looked back at entire decades of their lives and realized that they wasted most of their productive energy playing World of Warcraft, and it's for much the same reason. The reward loop just works so perfectly. Every accomplishment just lays out what the next challenge to overcome is. The new weapon kills a bigger monster, which gets a bigger weapon, which kills a bigger monster, and so on and so forth for as long as you want to continue that experience. Something like this seems to have happened to Chef Slowik. He seems to have started his cooking career based on a passion for the work, but to have slowly shifted towards defining his success in terms of achieving milestones of recognition. He basically dedicated his whole life to climbing the ladder that he's now at the top of, and it's only here at the top, without another rung above him to focus on, that he realizes that he doesn't even particularly enjoy what he does. He confides this much to Aaron in the movie.
I haven't desired to cook for someone in ages. And one does miss that feeling.
Here at the end of the line, he's realized that nothing that he's achieved or accomplished matters to other people in the same way that it matters to him. He can't seem to find an external mirror that shows him that he made the right choices in life, and that he really is as special and talented as he thinks he is. In a lot of ways, Slowik is trapped in a kind of hell that Jean-Paul Sartre laid out in his play No Exit, a play in which hell is depicted as an ordinary room where three people are free to sort of just hang out. There are no lava pits or grotesque demons in this hell. The hell outlined in the play is one in which the inhabitants are simply denied earthly distractions to prevent them from taking an internal inventory and coming to terms with the choices that they made in their lives. That is to say, they have no distractions save for one, the other occupants of the room. The only thing that there really is to do in Sartre's hell, aside from reflect on your own actions, is to try to convince the other inhabitants of the room to see you the way that you want to be seen. There are no mirrors in the room, so the only way that a person can get any kind of external validation is to coax it out of the other inmates. Basically, the only pastime aside from self-reflection is to try to convince the other members of hell that you're really not a bad person and that you don't belong there. But as the character of Garson figures out, this is precisely what makes this room hell. No matter how hard he tries, he simply cannot get his two roommates to tell him what he wants to hear, that he isn't a coward and he doesn't belong in hell. Now, it's not that he can't get them to say the words. They essentially tell him what he wants to hear the first time that he asks. It's just that he knows that they don't mean it. They're saying it the way someone might say, uh-huh, in a conversation where what they really want is for the other person to shut up so that they can talk. It isn't enough to him that they tell him that he isn't a coward. He wants to know that he's convinced them. He wants to use them as a mirror, to have them confirm for him that he really is the person that he tells himself he is. But the problem is that they aren't interested in being his mirror. They want the exact same thing from him that he wants from them. The state that these people are trapped in which every person is trying and failing to use the other two as mirrors, is what leads to the quote that's most famously associated with the play: "Hell is other people." With a little thought, it's clear that Sartre isn't making some nihilistic people equals shit statement here. What he's saying is that we know ourselves better than anyone else does, and if we can't form an independent sense of who we are that's resistant to the uninformed, self-referential perspectives of other people, we'll be doomed to live unhappy lives. Just consider for a moment the fact that Hollywood celebrities seem to be some of the least happy people on the planet, and it seems that Sartre was onto something. No amount of material success will bring you happiness if you can't maintain a sense of self that stands on its own. A direct implication of this interpretation of hell is that it's a condition that anyone is free to leave at any time should they decide that they valued their own opinions of themselves more highly than the opinions of others. And we see exactly this play out in Sartre's play. Garson decides that one of the other room occupants is a bit of an airhead, and that he shouldn't care one way or the other what she thinks about his character. And in that moment that he decides that he can define himself, the door to the room opens. In that moment, he has the opportunity to walk right out of hell and never return, but tragically he's unable to make himself leave. He elects to stay in hell because it occurs to him that the other occupant of the room, Inez, might be able to see in him the qualities that he wishes that other people would see. Sartre's hell is one that people voluntarily trap themselves in and remain trapped in because of a need for external validation. And it's hard not to draw a parallel to the situation that Chef Slowik finds himself in. He could leave this position that's brought him to a homicidal level of dissatisfaction at any moment, and all that he would need is a sense of self that's secure enough to resist the gossip and rumors that would begin to swirl if he chose to do so. Some people might suggest if he stepped down that he left because he was starting to lose his touch, or because one of his pupils was beginning to outshine him, or because he just couldn't handle the pressures of the job. And because Slowik's sense of self is too fragile to withstand this, he's left with two choices. He either has to keep working in this position that he hates, or he has to leave it in a way that sends a message that's so spectacularly shocking that it forces people to see his departure the way that he wants them to see it. Just like the character of Garson in No Exit, Chef Slowik has trapped himself in a kind of hell through his inability to decide for himself who he is. More than anything, he wants his guests to serve as his mirror. He wants them to tell him that he's a visionary genius, and he wants to know that they mean it. He wants his diners to stop taking pictures of his food and focus their attention on it so that they're better able to admire it. He wants them to understand how great his food is. It isn't enough to him that people tell him that it's great or that they're willing to pay an insane amount of money to eat it, because he knows that there are purely egotistical reasons that people might tell him what he wants to hear. The finance bros might compliment his work not because they have any appreciation for it, but because they get off on the idea that they're the only ones that get to have this experience. The fancy world-renowned chef is making food for them and not the other low-life peasants of the world. The restaurant critics will compliment his work to the extent that doing so elevates their status, to the extent that it cements the idea in everyone's minds that they are the real authorities on what foods are good and bad. The has-been actor trying to relaunch his career as a travel documentary host wants to develop a relationship with Slowik that he can cash in on later, so his praise can only be interpreted as opportunism. And Tyler just wants other people to think that he's special for getting Slowik's food. He hasn't even boarded the boat to get to the restaurant before he's criticizing other guests as being fake foodies. He also seems totally convinced that he's the only one in the dining room that really understands Slowik's work. And though he's moved to tears by Slowik's description of the job of a chef, he can't even finish explaining why he's so moved before he's right back to photographing his plate. Tyler's not crying here because Slowik's words genuinely moved him, he's crying because he's so impressed with himself for being the only person in the room who got it. He's so completely captured by the idea that he's in some way Slowik's equal that he fails to see the obvious mockery of the breadless bread dish even after Aaron points it out to him. This is probably why Slowik develops such a special hatred for Tyler. Slowik wants the guests in his dining room to be his mirror, but Tyler is the guest who has the most obvious intent of using him as a mirror. It's important to Slowik that he make Tyler understand how ridiculous this fantasy is. He needs him to know that it's a fantasy, and that even though he can list the ingredients that he tastes in his food, that he could never have created anything like he did. Similarly, Slowik senses very accurately that the reason that his followers are so devoted to him is because they expect to in some way pick up on some of his greatness. They expect to imitate and possibly one day surpass what he's accomplished. And it's important to him that they understand that they never will, that he is the great one. But no matter how hard Slowik tries to use other people as a mirror, the only thing that he seems to encounter is people who are doing this right back to him. Nobody from his financiers to his followers to his patrons seem to value him the way that he wants to be valued. They all value him for what he can do for them. The only person who it seems is an exception to this rule is Erin. She alone among all of the guests in his dining room is just along for the ride, with no stake invested in what her being there says about her. I mean, after all, she's there under the fake identity of Margit. So I think it's safe to say that she doesn't have any plans of posting about her trip on Instagram. This is why Slowik takes such a specific interest in her. Her praise is the only praise that he could take as being completely genuine with no ulterior motive. But the very thing that gives her this unique status is the same thing that means she ultimately can't give him what he wants. She just isn't terribly interested in the type of food that he serves. This is almost the deepest type of injury that you can do to somebody like Slowik. Not belittlement, not imitation, not condescension, but just genuine, pure indifference. Let's return for a moment to the fundamental insight of the Roman Stoics. We would be wise to only strive to attain things that we ourselves are in control of, and to completely disregard the things that we aren't in control of. And chief among the things that we ought to disregard is whether we're held in esteem by other people. This is an insight that humankind seems to continually need to remind itself of. Every generation has its fictional cautionary tale about the dangers of defining oneself through the lens of other people. From Jay Gatsby to Charles Foster Kane to Daniel Plainview, our films and novels are full of these figures who are meant to be warnings about what goes wrong when we try to use other people as a metric that we judge ourselves by. A lot of the most popular new media commentators have risen to prominence in large part due to the way that they've reinterpreted and re-expressed these Stoic insights. And in my mind, that just goes to show you that the emotional difficulties that these insights help us to navigate are just a universal part of the human experience.
This is another important practice Marcus Aurelius does in Meditations, where he goes, think of all these famous people who were so important. Where are they now? Who cares? We think this matters so much. We think that our legacy is so important. It will be gone soon enough.
Podcaster Chris Williamson's numerous interviews with gym owner and entrepreneur Alex Hormozi are full of these fantastic modern takes on classic Stoic principles.
It doesn't matter whether I achieve all of my goals or I don't achieve all of the goals. In 3 generations, I'll be forgotten, and the only people who were naysaying against me will also be dead. And so then it's like, just do it for me. And then when I wake up every day, there's only one voice I have to listen to.
I just love Chris's response in this clip. His mind just goes right to the obvious question that Stoic insights should lead one to.
But that means that you need to be able to work out what to do from first principles. You now no longer have societal norms or assistants or role models or archetypes or expectations, and that's also difficult in a different way.
As Chris correctly points out, applying this wisdom in your life still leaves you needing an answer for one of the hardest questions to answer. How should you live your life? This is why my favorite modern reinterpretation of the Stoic principle of living life for yourself is the version that's expressed by angel investor Naval Ravikant. In a podcast interview with Shane Parrish of the Knowledge Project, he made a statement that has a lot of overlap with what we just saw in the clip with Alex Hormozi, but he adds a little bit of a twist that helps his message to resonate with Cheeto dust-covered degenerates like me.
And we're such social creatures. We're more like bees or ants, that we're externally programmed and driven, that we just don't know how to play and win at these single-player games anymore. We compete purely on multiplayer games. But the reality is life is a single-player game. You're born alone. You're going to die alone. All your interpretations are alone. All your memories are alone. And you're gone 3 generations. Nobody cares. Before you showed up, nobody cared. It's all single-player.
Life is a single-player game. Something about that way of expressing this set of ideas just lodges itself deep in my lizard brain. I don't intellectualize this point when it's made this way, I feel it on a deep level. You see, I've played a lot of both types of video games, and I've played them for very different reasons. You play most multiplayer games with some hope of performing better than the other people playing it, of winning by a defined set of rules. Or at the very least, what you're hoping for is to perform in the game in a way that other people are going to find noteworthy. But a single-player game is one that you play for the experience itself. When I load up Amnesia the Bunker, I'm not concerned with whether I'm playing the game the right way or whether my clear time is better or worse than anyone else's. My interest in the experience stems from its ability to take me to another place, to make me feel totally immersed in the setting and the experience. In the case of that game, the experience is one of needing new underwear every time that the overhead lights flicker. But my point is that in a single-player game, there's no point aside from that you're sucked into the experience. When you're playing a particularly engaging single-player game, you might actually begin to some degree to lose a sense of who you even are. Your Joe-ness just doesn't seem like it's that relevant to the experience. For these little moments, it's almost like you and the screen cease to be two different things, and you both become part of this new thing, this pure experience. Now, Naval has further developed this line of thinking in other interviews that he's participated in, to the point that this idea of life being a single-player game has basically taken on the form of being a complete worldview. And I say a complete worldview because it doesn't just provide us with strategies for avoiding misery, it tells us how we're likely to find peace and fulfillment as well. It tells us that we're likely to find enjoyment in life in the same way that we'll best avoid misery, by treating the experience of our lives as just that, a pure experience, and not wasting any time trying to come up with stories in our minds about who we are and how other people ought to view us, etc. If an NPC in a single-player game is hostile towards you, you don't have any instinct to take it personally. You just say, alright, I guess that character's an asshole. I mean, most of the time that's what you do.
Do you get to the Cloud District very often? Oh, what am I saying? Of course you don't.
You like Huey Lewis and the News?
If you think about what your life is, it's basically this series of colors, sounds, and sensations that seems to play on a screen located somewhere inside of the skull of some weird, lanky, hairless ape creature. If we're lucky, this movie runs for something like 80 to 90 years from the time that we're born, and then it just stops running. What Naval is encouraging us to do is to recognize that at any moment, the only real thing is the colors, sounds, and sensations themselves. The stories that we tell ourselves about those sensations are sometimes very valuable. For instance, having the idea of tiger in your mind is a very useful one if you forage for honey in the Sundarbans for a living. But the older I get, the practice of viewing myself as a thing that's separate from all the other things in the world and spending all this time coming up with stories about how I'm related to all the other things, well, it just seems to be beneficial in fewer and fewer situations. I mean, at this point, I've basically gotten it down to crosswalks and sharp objects. I don't want to just experience a crosswalk. I get a lot of value out of the story that I'm a squishy thing, and cars are good at pulverizing squishy things. But Susan, the grocery store cashier who won't let me use a coupon twice even though it clearly says limit 2 per customer, I think I'm just fine treating her as an experience. That isn't to say that the experience won't be an annoying one, but I don't need to turn Susan into a tiger. If I really want 2 value packs of steaks, I can just ask to talk to the manager, which means I'm gonna be there for 5 minutes longer than I otherwise would have been there. Or I can just decide that I need to lose weight anyways, and I'll just take one of the value packs. It would be a total waste of time and energy to sit there and ruminate about what this experience meant, about that I'd been wronged and it was disrespectful to my time and yada yada yada. The thing is, Susan's actions probably didn't have anything to do with me. She probably got yelled at the last time she incorrectly let a customer use a coupon twice, and she's probably just afraid of losing her job. Any story that I could tell myself about the situation could be a literal hallucination just as easily as it could be true, and the time could be better spent thinking about literally anything else. If I spend an hour ruminating over feeling like someone disrespected me, I essentially just lost an hour of my life. When we're on our deathbeds, we don't wish for more time to commit to telling ourselves stories about who or what has fucked us over. We wish that we had more time to spend being present in the moment. We wish that we had more time to spend with our friends and loved ones, or to do the things that we enjoyed doing. And I think that the luckiest person alive isn't the person that's born with the sharpest mind, or the most useful talent, or the richest parents, or any of that. It's the person who recognizes this truth the earliest. It's the person who realizes with the most amount of time remaining in their life that the only times that they're going to look back on fondly in old age are moments in which they were completely immersed in the current moment. People have been trying to tell the younger generation this exact thing for millennia. But like I said before, it seems that every generation needs to relearn some lessons for themselves. Ancient philosophers seemingly wanted more than anything else for the pain that they'd experienced in their lives to serve as a sort of guide for other people, to help them to avoid the snags that they'd encountered in their lives, to help them live fuller, happier lives. But one of the things that often prevents us from heeding this advice is that frequently we assign as much importance to who the messenger is as to what their message is, and we fundamentally can't relate to people who lived in marble statue times. When we're young, we think that we are the first people having any experience. How then could Socrates have anything valuable to tell us if he never had to deal with fucking Susan? It says right there in the goddamn flyer. Philosophy seems to share something in common with art. We experience it self-referentially. We can't take a message of any value from some work unless we see something about ourselves reflected in it. This is why it tends to be something that people value more highly as they age. They've just had more experiences, and as a result, they have an increased ability to relate to the experiences of other people. But I think that we're always going to need these generational rediscoveries of old wisdom because, especially when we're younger, we need to see these ideas play out in the lives of people that we aspire to be like. A lot of young people will see in Alex Hormozy something like an ideal that they'd like to shoot for in life, and in that way his advice has way more potency to them than the advice of a dead Roman emperor ever could. But I think that the biggest benefit of modern reinterpretations of ancient wisdom comes in instances where it helps us to understand ways of seeing the world that are outside of our own cultural lens. One of the reasons that the podcast interviews of Naval Ravikant have been so valuable to me personally is that a lot of the messages from Eastern philosophy were able to reach me for the first time because they came from him. One of the roadblocks that I had always encountered in trying to understand the takeaway messages of classic works of Eastern philosophy is just the fact that the way that I think about concepts like the self has been fundamentally shaped by the culture that I live in. In my case, even though I'm not a religious person in any traditional sense, I still see the world through a set of values and interpretive paradigms that were largely shaped by Christianity, whether or not I recognize that this is true. So to hear any Eastern philosopher talk about ideas like surrendering the self, I couldn't help but interpret that idea through the lens of the Christian idea of selflessness, the idea that you should deprioritize your own needs and treat the needs of others around you as just as important as yours. And whenever I'd encounter that type of advice, I'd just sort of put the book down. What? No, I read book. Fuck, all right. What I mean is I would turn off the video of Alan Watts talking over stock footage of nature.
But behind our whole thought in the West is the idea that the world is an artifact, that it is put together by...
But when I heard these ideas expressed by Naval, in a lot of ways it was like hearing them for the first time. The fact that he was the messenger just cut off a number of ways that I'd previously misinterpreted this wisdom. You see, Naval talks openly about the fact that he's an unapologetically selfish person. He basically refuses to do anything that he doesn't want to do. He doesn't set an alarm clock because he refuses to allow other people to dictate his comings and goings, and he basically never schedules any events because he doesn't know if his later self will still want to do those things. The man has had enormous success as an angel investor to boot, so in no way is my mind primed to take his advice as being to sit cross-legged under a tree until I stop wishing for KFC to bring back the double down, which is basically how I'd previously interpreted all Eastern philosophy. Listen to the way that Naval describes the challenge that self-obsession brings us.
If you're thinking about your personality and your ego and the character of you, and you're obsessing over that, that's where a lot of depression and unhappiness sort of lingers and gets cultivated. So thinking about woe is me, this happened to me, that happened to me, I have this personality, I have this issue, I deserve this, I didn't get that. You're just strengthening a little beast in there that is insatiable.
Naval is not advising us to stop thinking about ourselves in the Christian sense. If anything, the overall thrust of his message is that you'll be more effective in pursuing your true desires if you just drop all the made-up stories that you carry around about who you are and what you deserve and who has wronged you, etc. The more you approach life unburdened by these stories, the more the outcomes that you pursue will naturally reflect your own desires, not the desires that you've inherited secondhand from family, friends, society, whatever. In a way, you can think of Winnie the Pooh as being the perfect illustration of this ideal. The fact that he doesn't see the world through a lens in which his pooh-ness has much importance doesn't serve as any obstacle to his pursuing his passion for honey. If anything, he has more focus and energy to devote to his pursuit of honey because he doesn't squander his time telling himself unnecessary stories. Having finally found a way to apply the teachings of Eastern philosophy because I encountered them through the reinterpretations of Naval Ravikant, I've not only been able to tap into entirely new ways of thinking about the problems that we encounter in our lives, but I've also become convinced that philosophy is a process that's going to continue forever. No matter how self-evidently true or well-expressed an idea is, it will eventually need to be reinterpreted for later generations in a way that they can relate to. I now fundamentally see any time spent ruminating about why we can't learn the lessons of the past as time wasted when you could be trying to reinterpret those ideas in a way that modern minds will understand. And with that established, I'm keen to try my hand at reinterpreting a classic work of art. Look, if Billabong Gandalf gets to reinterpret old wisdom, I get to do it too. So watch as I transform a painting meant to communicate thousands of years of wisdom into a dank, relatable meme for gamers with Riz. This painting depicts an old allegory of three wise men tasting vinegar. The three men depicted are Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. There are many versions of this painting and none of them are considered the official one, but they all show the same scene. The three men are tasting a pot of vinegar, and their different reactions to the vinegar represent the perspectives of the school of thought that they're associated with, these being the three philosophies that have most dominated Eastern thinking: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. But forget all of that. In my version, they're three gamers playing the recently released Oblivion remaster. Confucius looks at the muted color palette, the fact that the nighttime transitions are a little underwhelming, and the weird visual glitches related to real-time reflections, and he says, this is a distortion from the true vision of what a remastered Oblivion should be. A series of patches and mods are gonna be needed in order to fix these problems and to turn this into the remaster that it always should have been. As soon as he finishes saying that, Buddha chimes right in. You've made a classic mistake. It was only your expectations and your desires that have led you to this place of feeling the dissatisfaction that you feel. It's only by conquering these desires within yourself that you'll be free of this pain. You're never going to resolve it with external solutions. And at the same time that these two are engaged in this conversation, Lao Tzu is making statues out of cheese wheels. Don't ask him why he's doing it, he couldn't tell you. He just likes doing it. In fact, it doesn't occur to him that any explanation or justification is necessary. He's completely lost in the experience. His sense of himself as being a separate thing from that experience has dissolved, and he has become the act itself. The smile on his face is not one of a dopamine hit like you'd get if you hit the jackpot on a slot machine. It's the smile of inner peace. It's the smile of a mind that's been freed from the shackles imposed by made-up stories. He's experiencing the game the way that toddlers experience the world, without any sense of himself as being a separate thing from the experience that he's having.
Bow before Lord Cheese Dick. I said bow, ya shits.
His smile of a mind that's achieved a kind of rest is the smile that you get to see Chef Slowik experience in the menu, if only for a brief moment. There is so much that you can take away from the menu, but this scene basically defines what I took away from it. When the movie pops back into my mind, which happens often, it's because something happened in my life that reminded me of this scene. Before Chef Slowik was weighed down by the crushing weight of his status and reputation, he seemingly enjoyed cooking for its own sake. either the act itself or the pleasure that it brought other people, or maybe some combination of both of those things. And when Aaron asks him to drop all of this hoity-toity high-concept bullshit and just make her a goddamn cheeseburger, what she's done is given him permission to just drop the stories, to stop thinking about what his food says about him, and to produce something for the joy that it will bring and for no other reason. For the first time in presumably years, he's having a pure experience. He's cooking to cook. He's in what you might call the flow state. The only thing that exists to him for this brief moment in time is the act that he's committed to. In this moment, we see him achieve inner peace. His smile is the smile of someone who stopped wasting inner energy trying to make tigers out of everything around him. I mean, like, 5 minutes later, he marshmallow explodes the whole restaurant, so it's not like it's a totally happy ending, but I still found this moment to be poignant and beautiful. It stands out to me as a movie scene that punches way above its weight in terms of its length and cinematic complexity, in terms of just how much space it's carved out in my mind. The thought experiment that's most structured my thinking about how to live a good life for the last couple of decades is a bit of a no-shit Sherlock thought experiment, but I still think that it provides an unbelievably powerful framework. It's Albert Camus' thought experiment in which you alone find a blank canvas on the top of a mountain. The idea being expressed here is that there's two ways that this blank canvas can be interpreted, and only one of those ways is going to lead to a happy life. You can see painting on this canvas one of two ways, as an act of futility because you're alone and nobody will therefore be able to recognize what you've done, or as an unbelievable opportunity because the absence of external judgment of any form means that you can just paint whatever you want to paint. Life basically is a blank canvas on a mountaintop. Nobody cares what we do during the course of our lives in the way that we think they care. Our accomplishments, to the extent that we achieve them, are only appreciated by other people self-referentially. We aren't remembered as we were, we become ink blot tests for later generations, and the second that they no longer see anything in us that makes them feel better about themselves, it becomes as though we never existed. And so the only thing that really matters in life is whether we value the experience of our lives for its own sake. But the reason that I say this is a no-shit Sherlock thought experiment is that the thing that's missing from it is the only important thing. How the fuck do I stop defining myself through the lens of other people? Millions of years of evolution are screaming at me to try to please the people around me. Don't just tell me not to do this, tell me how to do something else. In my mind, there are two major strategic branches in conditioning yourself to see the blank canvas of life as the opportunity that it is. The strategies where you conceive of yourself as a separate thing from the rest of the world, and the strategy of not doing this at all. You can either stop trying to explain the experience of your life as consisting of a bunch of independent things and see everything, including you, as just part of an experience, or you can go about your life as though the floating movie in your skull is a separate and independent you. From my perspective, neither of these approaches is superior to the other, and in fact, it may be beneficial to jump back and forth between them over the course of your life. Stoicism provides fantastic strategies for avoiding pain and suffering, and for maintaining a sense of focus through hardship, but it only works in combination with an internal sense of what's important in life. There's a serious hazard in applying this strategy if you set your guiding principles around achieving any kind of external goal. You can find yourself in a serious crisis if you either achieve that goal or if you realize that you no longer find it appealing. Chef Slowik is a great fictional example of this exact thing occurring, but consider also the real-life example of astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man to walk on the moon. Aldrin tailored his entire career around the goal of walking on the moon. He did his doctoral thesis on orbital rendezvous because he thought that this would be important in a manned mission to the moon. He joined NASA at age 33, was selected for the Gemini program at age 36, and at the age of 39 he accomplished the exact thing that had served as his goal in life. The decade that followed the moon landing was one in which Aldrin struggled with a severe sense of purposelessness. He found no satisfaction in transitioning to a more conventional role in the Air Force, and that led him to resign in 1972. He suffered from alcoholism and went through 2 divorces in the decade after the moon landing. Now, fortunately, he seems to have recovered and to have found a new sense of purpose as an advocate for continuing advancements in manned spaceflight, and he's also become an advocate for mental health awareness. I like his example because I think it highlights something very important. If your guiding principle in life is based around a mission, you either need to be good at coming up with new missions as you achieve your goals, or you need to have a mission that can't be completed in a conventional sense. The other strategy for living a fulfilled life is one that I've only just begun to experiment with in my life since Naval popped my Taoism cherry. To apply this strategy, you have to go all the way back to the famous thought experiment of René Descartes. He became fascinated in defining the things in his life that he could say that he truly knew, that required zero assumptions to say that he knew. And he concluded that there was only one thing he knew as certainty. I think, therefore I am. I don't know if anything that I'm seeing is real, but I do know that I exist in some form just by virtue of the fact that I'm having a conscious experience. If you think about it though, an assumption slipped into his thinking, and it's the I part. It would seemingly be more accurate not to say, I think therefore I am, but to say, with certainty, some experience exists. It isn't that I think, therefore I exist as this separate object from these other sensations. The sensations themselves are the only thing that can be known to be real, and the thoughts that emerge about these sensations can themselves be thought of as just another type of sensation. It's therefore unnecessary to waste any time trying to explain these sensations unless there's a direct benefit to doing so. There seems to be some benefit to explaining sensations like open flame, tiger, or Ted Bundy. But it seems that this is less the case for sensations like Susan. To the greatest extent practically possible then, one should experience the sensations as nothing but sensations. Lao Tzu is often thought of as having had an internal existence very similar to that of a child. When you dangle keys in front of a child, they just laugh. They don't need to waste any time mulling over how others will see them if they laugh, and they don't even waste inner energy thinking of the laughing as being something that they are doing. That's how perfectly committed they are to the act of laughter. And here's the thing. There's a sense in which you may be better equipped to avoid suffering altogether if you follow the principles of Stoicism. You just always have these shields up in the Stoic mindset that serve as these very powerful tools. If you live your life the way that a child lives their lives, wrapped up in that is that sometimes you'll be hurt or disappointed, or you'll experience actual physical pain that pulls you out of a state of bliss. But the benefit of living your life this way is that when these experiences pass, you won't be weighed down by these things having happened. You'll be able to experience joy again as soon as it occurs. Consider, after all, how quickly a crying child can switch right back into laughter. If negative experiences fade from your mind as soon as they're over, you won't have the opportunity to ruminate over them and turn them into these stories that shape how you perceive every detail of your life. You'll sail right through the turbulent waters of life right back into clear skies and sunshine, without dwelling on the things that bother you long enough that you can only express your feelings through dessert murder. You shouldn't do that. It's a bad thing to do. Don't do that. Thanks very much for watching if you made it all the way through the video. I hope that you found something of value in it. I made this channel as a second channel in order to have a place to just make whatever videos pop into my mind. I also recently made a channel in which I review games based on a 4-category rubric that I made up. And what I noticed as I was writing videos for that channel is that I was having a hard time focusing. I was turning scripts for what were supposed to be game reviews into these bloated monstrosities that just contained every thought that had popped into my head while I played the games. It dawned on me eventually that I just constantly bounce between two modes of thought. One where I like structure and having a clear mission at the start of the creative process, and one in which I just want to explore whatever is interesting to me at the moment with no limitations whatsoever. And I just kind of recently had an epiphany. It's basically a waste of time for me to try to make videos that are a kind of negotiation of these two modes that I vacillate between. I figured I ought to just have 2 channels, one where I focus and make videos with a clear objective, and one where I'm not limited by any format at all, and I can just talk about whatever pops into my head. I'm adding this disclaimer to the end of this video for the sole purpose of saying I don't know what my upload frequency is going to be here, or even what type of videos I'm predominantly going to make, although I have a pretty strong hunch that they're mostly going to be based around thoughts that I've had related to movies, games, or books. I've made this channel as much for the purpose of helping me focus on the other channel as I've made it for its own sake. I think that I'm probably going to default to making videos on that channel, and that this is going to be the place that I come to when some line of thinking is just dominating my thoughts to the point that it's getting hard to focus on that channel. Who knows, maybe I'll eventually post more here than I do there, or maybe I'll barely ever post here. But in any event, thank you for watching. I've got a couple of ideas outlined for future things that I might do on this channel, but those ideas are in a pretty rough state at the moment, so it may be a while before I'm back on this channel, or it could be in a couple of weeks. I'll just have to leave it at that. I'll see you when I see you, and thanks again so much for watching.